Bonjour mes amis, this is the history of map game by me. I am Siley. If you are in my Discord server, then you will know that I've been typing this up for a while and talking about it for the past week or so. And yeah, I mean, this is I was about to say biggest, but frankly it's the only video that I've released in a very long time. And well, yeah. But about this video specifically, I just want to say it now so that you guys know this video might be lacking graphically. So honestly, I would recommend putting this in the background of something else that you're doing. I don't know what you people do, but anyways, I should probably begin now. Yes, that sounds smart. Alright, the first event that you need to know for the lore is the Great Death. And before I get into that, I just wanted to kind of shout out Mr. Btw, who is on my server. He contributed really a lot to the lore of map games, so that is pretty cool. I'm probably gonna put his YouTube channel in the description, so he makes cool stuff, I think. Alright, anyways, basically, the lore of the Great Death is that Russia, under Vladimir Putin, decides to invade China over Mongolia and Manchuria in 2005. Why, you may ask? Who knows? It was never stated exactly why, but regardless, it's most likely that his justifications, of course, were laid out in a strange short interview that had been lost to time in the timeline of a map game. The EU then intervened in the conflict against Russia, obviously, as the front lines of the European front stagnated after, a little bit of fighting. Putin, in his crazed, and I quote, cult-like state, decided to fire a nuclear warhead on London. This event right here was the beginning of the Great Death, as it was called. I don't know why I said that, whatever. In retaliation, the EU had nuked St. Petersburg, called, and I'm not joking, Putingrad, in their timeline. And after that, the United States intervened in the conflict for some reason, and at this point, nuclear annihilation became inevitable. The nuclear winter following this nuclear annihilation, which wasn't actually annihilation because it was the winter, but that winter nearly wiped out humanity with the exceptions of a few locations, which would become the future of civilization, such as this country list that I have here of the countries that emerged following the Great Death. It's actually like 200 years after the Great Death, but it is following. The Federated Mediterranean Isles, the Empire of Zapatoslavia, the Celestial Realm of Brazil, the United Federal States of America, the Ottoman Empire, somehow, the Chola Kingdom, the Nahua Empire, Pidvalna Respublika, the Great Lakes Country, the Confederation of the Benelux, Awitara, Crimea, the Constitutional Kingdom of the North Sea, the Tsardom of Belarus. And well, now, I'm actually going to start it now. Yay. The Federated Mediterranean Isles. The Isles were a federation of islands in the Mediterranean Sea. Its capital was Palma in the Balearic Isles, though it was originally Valletta in Malta. The isles began with around the West Mediterranean, roughly encompassing the Balearic Isles, Sardinia, and Corsica. Over time, they'd grow to conquer Malta, the Aegean Islands, Crete, and Cyprus. In terms of politics, the Isles were a merchant republic, not unlike those in medieval Italy. But it wasn't Italian. It was a mix of all different cultures. Jesus, that was a horrible voice. It was a mix of all different cultures among the islands it controlled. The original 3 islands were by far the most important, though. Of course, the Balearic Isles had the capital Palma, as already mentioned, but Sicily was the economic core of the Isles, and Corsica was home to the most important naval base in the entire Mediterranean. Also, its elected president, Nicholas Klouros, was Greek. The Isles, especially in comparison to the country surrounding it, was quite peaceful, even despite its multiculturalism. In many conflicts, it was neutral and often sided with the less extreme option when forced to choose. They were noticeable in their role in the Sardinia conflict, which you'll learn what that is pretty soon, where they acted as a neutral mediator. Throughout the years, the Isles continued to grow economically, becoming a respectable economy, especially for their size. They had also grown to own the largest navy in the entire world, dominating the Mediterranean and really all the waters of Europe and the Middle East. So that is the Isles. The Empire of Zapanoslavia, which, no, I'm the one who played that one. Alright, so, following the Great Death, Czechia was one of the very first countries to pick itself out of the ashes. The
Přemyslovci.
dynasty returned to Bohemia, where Valentin
Přemyslovec.
quickly gained popularity for his promises for order, unification, and peace. After making an agreement with Moravia, the Kingdom of Bohemia-Moravia was born. That quickly grew and became Czechoslovakia, encompassing Slovakia. Anyways, Silesia was also conquered, and the king soon announced they would assimilate Poland, yay, and they became the Empire of Zapanoslavia, in the capital of Krakow. Despite all this territorial expansion, the king was sort of unpopular. I'll tell you why. His domestic policy was at best stagnating and at worst completely failing. Prosperity was not what he had delivered. And on top of that, the king made an agreement called the Treaty of Istanbul, with the Ottoman Empire dividing Yugoslavia into 2 between them. This deal was kind of unpopular, as it did not secure all of Yugoslavia. In fact, allied Zapadislavia and the Ottoman Empire in the Istanbul Accords, which was controversial. And so a far-right nationalist leader named Tomasz Czermak promised to undo this perceived injustice. He and a large crowd rioted outside the king's palace in Prague. One of Czermak's first promises was to renegotiate the Treaty of Istanbul to include all of Yugoslavia. However, before he could, the Ottoman Empire marched into Macedonia, which was definitely a blow to Czermak's initial popularity. During this time, the Grand Duchy of Luxembourg joined the Istanbul Accords, after some discussion between the 2 countries. And shortly after, the Sardinia Conference was held in Brazil, in which Zapanoslavia was promised lands in Africa. It was a conference for colonialism. And importantly, it was negotiated that all of Yugoslavia, besides Macedonia, would be Zapanoslavia. It was by itself good for Czermak, but its greatness was definitely amplified by him because he was a powerful propagandist, a masterful propagandist. I know how to read. Following this, Zapanoslavia entered a mini golden age. It conquered all of Poland finally and was generally peaceful. However, prosperity once again started to falter after moderate stagnation. Nothing crazy, but still. Czermak, egotistical as he was, began to expand his grip on the state, citing, quote, divine inspiration. In response to these factors, socialists within Zapanoslavia protested. How devious, diabolical. Czermak continued to expand his grip over the state, and the socialists continued to protest. Rinse and repeat, with every continual cycle only growing more and more extreme. And soon after, the
Fioletowy opór.
revolted against the empire in northern Poland and western Czechia. Tens of thousands died, front lines stagnated, and soon the Slovak Free State revolted as well, being a more conservative state than the
Fioletowy opór.
Sherlock is extremely paranoid at this point and has banned everything he considered, quote, leftist ideology, including liberalism. The Civil War continues to rage on to this day, being unresolved by the end of map game. And that is Zapatoslavia. The celestial realm of Brazil. Originally, this country, despite being called Brazil, perhaps oddly, started out in the region of the Levant in the Middle East. At this time, the main people groups were the Italians, who were in the majority for some reason, and Syrian Arabs. The country's completely mysterious first leader, Rosor, unified the country and called it, quote, the most serene republic of the Levant, inspired by the real-life most serene republic of Venice. Rosor's appeal was originally seen by the lower class and Arabs. He believed in multiculturalism, especially in regards to the Arabs of the region, and he pioneered programs which massively expanded infrastructure construction. His main opponent was Admiral Faliero, who was something of an Italian nationalist. He was mainly supported by a, quote, intellectual elite and the military. Faliero won the Levantine elections, however he was quickly hospitalized while giving a speech by a Syrian nationalist who was promptly executed. Under Faliero's rule, the Suez Canal was rebuilt, and the Levant expanded both north and south. In the northward expansion, they started to draw into conflict with the Ottoman Empire over parts of southeast Anatolia. However, eventually an agreement was made, and the land was equally split, roughly. But during this, of course, the oppression of the Arabs in both that area and other ones continued. But no longer would the Arab populations tolerate said oppression. With this, a civil war in Syria between the Italians under Faliero and the Arab Muslim Brotherhood terror organization began. They quickly moved on Damascus, called Lucina by the Italians, demanding legal reforms. Predictably, the United States intervened on the side of the Italians, quickly defeating the insurgencies with helicopters that they had somehow acquired. Subsequently, the Sardinia Conference occurred, with the colonies. The Republic took an active role in its conference, having already conquered the Sinai, the Horn of Africa, and Cape Colony. It initially desired parts of northern Africa, but the Ottoman Empire once again stood in the way of its ambitions. Instead, it conquered much of western Africa from Somalia to Morocco. Having influence over both the Red Sea and Strait of Gibraltar helps it to gain massive naval influence for a short time, and indeed, much of the late Italian era was dominated by colonialism from East Asia to Africa, to South America, of course, and in particular, Brazil. A large group of Brazilians, similar to the Italians, had moved to the Levant after the Great Death, but never enough to dominate demographically. That was until the colonization of Brazil. At that point, Brazilians slowly began to become a larger and larger part of the populace, moving to the Levant, eventually dominating and culminating in the declaration of the celestial realm of Brazil. Every major ethnic group within the realm gained some autonomy, including the Maghreb, the Italians, Levantine Arabs, Australians, and Indonesians. The future of the realm seems to be rooted in some sort of worldwide semi-colonial federation, but that is yet to be seen. The United Federal States of America. The United Federal States of America is by far the most lore-developed country on this server. So much so that it would probably take half this video if I were to cover every little detail. Therefore, I am inviting Bendo, who played this country, to make his own video on it if he's at all unhappy with the level of detail or honestly accuracy in this summary. Anyways, the first important event you should know is the election of Benjamin Washington. He was sort of a nationalist, but also a longist, inspired by Huey Long, and Republican, as in Republicanism, not the party, and ruled under martial law, greatly expanding the U.S. westwards from the East Coast in order to reunite the United States. He ultimately aimed to reinstate a republic after the unification, because he was Republican. Anyways, one of the first things Washington did was to align himself with the Great Lakes country. This alliance would prove to be quite lucrative, as you'll find in the next summary, but it did require giving up Wisconsin and Michigan, which was definitely something of a hit to Washington, you know what I mean. But following this, the South was reconquered and subsequently seceded again, this time as the Dixie Tribal Confederacy, beginning the Second American Civil War. They succeeded far less than they had in the First War, but little progress was still made on either sides. Shifting towards the state of the globe for just a second, the Civil War had broken out in the Benelux between the Grand Duchy of Luxembourg and the Belgian Socialist Republic. When the Socialists captured Brussels, Washington realized the Socialists were a threat to order in Europe. However, instead of defaulting to bombing the Socialists as they usually did, they showed some restraint and instead put their economic support behind the monarchists. Except when Dunkirk, which they occupied, but it wasn't a full invasion. Regardless, Ben Washington wasn't Washington when he walked into a coffee shop following an argument with his generals. He was immediately shot twice in the stomach. David Simmons was the man who shot him. He was a neo-Nazi trying to, quote, save the Aryan race. Following this assassination, communists rioted in the streets of New York, killing thousands. Soon, New York City was in full rebellion against the federal government. This caused a mass exodus of people fleeing New York City to come to the Great Lakes country. Eventually, this rebellion spread to New England. Anyways, the South, back to them for a sec, would also adopt Simmons' Nazi ideology, making him something of a martyr. However, their, quote, Führer was assassinated, and their, quote, Reich quickly collapsed. During this, Ben Washington Jr., who was the original Ben Washington's son, obviously, that's kind of what junior means, took power and transformed America from a military junta to a constitutional republic, which was met with ecstasy by the American public. As the new United American Republic under Ben Washington Jr. cleaned up the remains of the rebellions, relative prosperity settled in. The North American Economic Union was formed, including the UR and GLC, officially changing America's economy to the richest economy on earth. The Serena Conference was also upcoming. It was very famously fun and enjoyable by all participants. However, the UIR had perhaps the most controversial claims of any singular nation, which is saying something considering they honestly didn't claim all too much in comparison to other powers in the conference. Their first contested claim was the Congo, which was comprised of the DRC in our timeline. It was contested between the UAR and the Grand Duchy of Luxembourg. After much arguing and very little international support for the Americans, they did end up surrendering their claims, but not without compensation, of course. What they did actually get was Cameroon, Nigeria, which was also contested hotly, also between the U.S. and Luxembourg. At one point, sinking Nigeria into the ocean to avoid the conflict was considered. But, that's a different story. As well as the area around Liberia and Guinea, which nobody but them actually cared about, so it was fine. But once again, it was all said and done. No grudges were held, except on Luxembourg, who they'd accused repeatedly of mistreating their colonies, dubiously and possibly hypocritically. But after that, they invented the internet again, so that's cool. And after that, election time. The Center Party under President Wright won. They also changed the name to United American Democratic Republic instead of United American Republic to signal the change from martial law to, a United Democratic Republic. After the election, basically every party that wasn't center fractured a million times, until America had like an 89 party system or something. The Center Party created a new currency called the petrodollar, because oil, I guess, and deepened ties with the GLC. And then the Ottoman Empire collapsed, and they helped set up spheres of influence there, creating a Zionist state in southern Anatolia, as well as generally trying to stabilize and perhaps influence the region, propping up the political remnants of the Ottoman Empire against the imperial army, who opposed foreign influence. Following this, the Istanbul Accords seemed to be on steep decline as instability within Czechoslovakia become a bit of a boogeyman in the UADR accelerated. Luxembourg, however, wasn't so unlucky. They saw the despotism and instability, and fearing for their own stability, they left the Istanbul Accords at the suggestion of the UADR. As time went on, the Cold War between the UADR and Czechoslovakia grew ever colder as Czechoslovakia eventually entered a civil war between the royalists and the socialists. The UADR sent aid to both parties in the hopes of permanently weakening them both. For some reason, I don't know, they're like sadistic, I don't really know why. But anyways, elections in the UADR were two upcoming. The name was once again changed to the United Federal States of America, UFSA for some reason. Anyways, right, elections. The two-party system returned somehow between the Democratic Republicans and the centrists. Both sides went on long, hard campaigns for the election, and the winner is yet unseen, because the election never happened. Wow. Anyways, Great Lakes Country. The Great Lakes Country can be summarized in one word, and that one word is money. But before I get to that, let's go over some history first. The first major diplomatic course of action taken by the GLC was to make a border agreement with the UAR. An important point of this agreement was over Michigan and Wisconsin, which the GLC made sure to get for itself. But still, the UAR did manage to ensure access to the Great Lakes via the port of Chicago. Even then, GLC did get permission to build a railway through northern Indiana and Illinois to connect its territory in Minnesota to Michigan, but and they also had port access to Chicago. But, it was a productive deal for both parties, but, especially the GLC. While this deal initially may have seemed somewhat one-sided, it will soon become clear the GLC was nothing short of a godsend for the UAR to have as an ally. Anyways, the UAR fell apart in the civil war between the Confederates, Nazis, Communists, and the Union, of course. And President Kozinski, who had no first name, of the GLC was working on his campaign for the 2204 presidential election. His opponent was Joe Smith, who was slightly more globally minded, seeking to draw the GLC even closer to the UAR. Oh my goodness. And Kozinski once criticized Smith's infrastructure plans, which isn't that important, but I thought I'd include it. Another issue of importance in the GLC elections was immigration. Scary. From the UAR, and specifically New York after the communist insurrection. While the GLC was generally empathetic to the immigrants, it did create a bit of a border crisis, especially at Niagara Falls. The sudden nature of the uprising caused this whole crisis to be exacerbated even further, as many would-be immigrants had to have been turned around due to the lack of legal documentation. After this, the GLC devoted itself to stability in North America. It did this by forming the North American Economic Union with the UAR to economically assist and stabilize the region. The GLC's prosperity would indeed continue, with the Kozinski administration soon approving a massive rail infrastructure project all throughout the GLC and surrounding areas. From there, the GLC's GDP just kept going up, and honestly, that's about it. By the end, its GDP was around 75% higher than the average GDP of the world, and that's including itself, and nearly 25% higher than the second place economy. So that is it for the Great Lakes Country. Yippee. Confederation of the Benelux. The Confederation of the Benelux originated as the Grand Duchy of Luxembourg, which was not yet a Grand Duchy, but in fact a loose confederation of city-states. But it soon formed itself into a monarchical republic, a horrifyingly corrupt and disorganized monarchical republic, that is. As you can tell, what Luxembourg needed at this point was stability. And then came Grand Duke Lucas III, who was put into power by the military after the Republic fell. This was the beginning of the Grand Duchy. I have no way of making this seem like a long time, so just imagine a time passes and then Civil War. Belgium, which had been somewhat oppressed by the Grand Duchy since its inception, also happened to be socialist, which obviously meant they loved the Grand Duke, three grinning grinning face with star eyes emojis. Which is why they revolt against the Grand Duchy. Because the Grand Duke didn't have enough authority, of course. You see, this is actually a humorous statement because it's actually untrue. Anyway, the socialists attacked the Ghent area, particularly Gravenstein Castle. This offensive, which ended in success, prompted the UAR to aid the Grand Duchy economically and also by occupying Dunkirk for some reason, as I already mentioned. Anyways, next major battle time. I meant that. I read all of it before I recorded this video. The siege of Liège had been the bloodiest battle up to that point. Foreshadowing. With over 10,000 Belgian and over 3,000 Luxembourgish deaths. The Luxembourgers, unlike their performance in Ghent, managed to hold the city. Overall, bad news for the Belgians, but they still held the majority of the Benelux, plus Nord-Pas-de-Calais, northern France. Nonetheless, monarchist royalists rose up in the middle of Belgium, which, despite being unfortunately situated, was surprisingly strong. And the Belgian socialist forces were hugely depleted, and thus their victories dried up as well. And Brussels was recaptured pretty soon after by the Grand Duchy. The rebels shortly agreed to reintegration, and thus a new constitution was drafted, increasing autonomy in the Netherlands mainly for some reason. But anyways, things slowly started driven back towards normalcy with investments in infrastructure and political stabilization, and that would culminate in the creation of the European Economic Federation between the Grand Duchy and the Kingdom of Zapadoslavia. This event would also begin the series of events drawing the duchy towards the Istanbul Accords and especially Zapadoslavia. I should mention, even though the duchy had been reinstated in Belgium, the civil war had not ended. The commune of Francia still revolted against the duchy in Nord-Pas-de-Calais. And to call this final phase of the Luxembourgish Civil War a disaster would be an understatement. 100,000 men would perish in this fight. Especially in Calais, looting and scorched earth strategies were widespread, killing massive civilian populations. But through the ash, a new Luxembourg would arrive devoted to peace and prosperity. That is precisely why they almost immediately tried to colonize Africa. But first, election time. Not for Africa, of course, they didn't care what the Africans thought. It's fine though, because elections happen, and a leftist coalition with the Belgian Socialist Party, which is the same Belgian Socialists that fought in the Civil War 2 minutes ago, and a Reformist Party seeking to appease the Belgians and retake Dunkirk. Anyways, back to colonialism. The Duchy claimed the Congo and nearby parts of East Africa for itself, and the UAR had a problem with this. A big problem. The huge disagreement, I can read, between the UAR and Luxembourg, plus the Zapadoslavia, intervening, trying to mediate, but actually kind of leaning farther towards Luxembourg, ensued. This took a while, but eventually the Duchy prevailed. To the credit of the Duchy, it actually did give its colonies a good amount of autonomy. It didn't automatically erase their culture in the government. So hey, their colonialism wasn't as bad as other colonialism, I'm pretty sure. Anyways, a good bit of time passed, and another election. This time, the Reformist Party won alone, kicking the Socialists out of government. Anyways, they soon drafted a new constitution, which notably divided the Grand Duchy into many separate areas under a federation, the Confederation of the Benelux, with a good deal of autonomy, each state using their own currency, except for Africa, which had to have a common currency for itself for some reason. Anyways, time for more colonialism. Well, this time I was supposed to be proxies, but it's close enough. The Ottoman Empire collapsed, and with it, the Middle Eastern balance of power. Really, the entire balance of power in the East in general, seeing as the decline of Zapadoslavia had begun as well. After the UAR invaded Constantinople, which I think they renamed it to, Luxembourg quickly moved in to occupy several cities within the Ottoman Empire, including Izmir, to try and save it from collapse. But in the background, Luxembourg and the UAR began creating plans to carve up the empire if it didn't work out. Hint, it did not work out. So they carved it up, and that was that. The Ottoman Empire was theirs, really. The Levantines also took a bit of territory in this process. Anyways, Zapotaslavia, it had always been the close ally of Luxembourg, but rifts seemed to be spawning between the two, getting slightly wider every day. As Zapataslavia's Emperor Tomas became increasingly authoritarian and controlling, and Luxembourg more and more liberal and democratic, it became increasingly clear that the Istanbul Accords was collapsing. Its founding member, the Ottoman Empire, had already collapsed, and ideological differences became larger every day. Luxembourg started to seriously consider their options at this point. A vote was soon held in Luxembourg's parliament. The vote came out in 93 and 92 to leave the Istanbul Accords. However, they did in fact remain in the EEF. Soon after, Luxembourg would join the Alliance of Free Nations, directly going against their former Zapotaslavian ally. Following continuing liberalization and deeper ties, the Grand Duke abdicated peacefully as he was voted out by Parliament. Thus, the Grand Duchy was a duchy no longer, and in fact became the Confederation of the Benelux. At this point, it was the end of that game, but they continued to expand afterwards in lore and observed the Zapotaslavian still work closely, aiming for positive outcomes. And that will be it for Luxembourg. On we go to the Tsardom of Belarus. The Tsardom of Belarus may have been Zapotaslavia's last hope in their civil war. Belarus entered into existence as an imperial/monarchical Slavic state. Sound familiar? Naturally, they instantly grew close. Belarus was at first a little skeptical, but as discussion expanded, these topics naturally rose to consideration. A deal was soon made to incorporate Bialystok into Belarus in exchange for Istanbul Accords memberships. The two were soon very closely aligned. But not all was well. Firstly, the rebels in Zapotaslavia had ruined its stability and drove their emperor into insanity, of course. But a little close to home, the health of the Tsar was declining. He contracted a yet unknown sickness. He passed away in his bed as his wife watched over him peacefully. His wife, Irene Molotov, became Tsarina Irene following that event. The Tsarina was a good bit more reformist and diplomatic as compared to her late husband. Firstly, she saw that Imperial Zapatoslavia was a bit of a train wreck at the moment. And while she still officially supported the emperor and his legitimacy, she discreetly continued the material support of the Imperial Army of Zapatoslavia. She also took steps against corruption and towards individual civic freedoms, mirroring the liberal West of this timeline, as in basically just Luxembourg and UAR. But on the same note, she directed the government to invest more into industry and hugely expand the trade with just about anyone who was willing. Among these notable shifts and trends in the international standing, one lone note read, quote, Belarus is using prehistoric bacteria found in the bottom of ice in Siberia to make new advances in medicine, end quote. While it wasn't outright said, I think it likely that this is referencing her husband's death, which would actually be pretty good character development for the Tsarina. Yippee! Anyways, all these mentioned trends continued up until I got lazy and stopped map game. But it didn't have to be this way. That's right. And perhaps the most predictable plot twist since the Belgian Socialist Republic, in fact, not liking the Grand Duke of Luxembourg. Map game 2. Yippee! Yippee! All those yippies on the screen. Look at them. They spent more time getting those yippies to do that than they did to make this entire slide. But regardless, that's right. Map game 2 is back, even though I said I probably would never do it. I might regret doing it, but still. This is pretty cool, actually, I think. So, be there. I'm going to make a video later today on that, where I will show you all the rule set that I've made, the maps and everything. So, yeah. This has been Siley. I am Siley. And yeah, I'll see you guys soon. Maybe, hopefully, probably. Farewell.